For the first time in years, the United States Navy does not have a single aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. Not one. Not near Taiwan. Not near the South China Sea. Not near Japan. Not near the Philippines. And here's the strange part. This is happening under an administration that has publicly said again and again that the Pacific matters more than anywhere else on Earth, more than the Middle East, more than Europe. The official doctrine is clear: Asia first, everything else second. So why does the map right now show exactly the opposite? The USS George Washington is pulling out of Asia. Its replacement in the Middle East is the USS Abraham Lincoln, a ship that has now spent more than 240 consecutive days at sea, the longest uninterrupted carrier deployment American sailors have faced since before most of them were born. And the reason the Lincoln needs relief in the first place isn't really about strategy. It's about exhaustion. Reports have raised concerns about the mental health of the crew and supply shortages on board a ship that was never supposed to stay out this long. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, China has spent the last month doing exactly what it does whenever it senses an opening: running drills near the Scarborough Shoal, a contested reef claimed by both Beijing and Manila, and sending a guided missile destroyer to conduct live-fire exercises off Okinotori, one of Japan's southernmost islands. The stated priority says one thing, the deployment map says another. That's the contradiction this video is going to sit inside. Not, is China about to invade Taiwan? Nobody serious is claiming that. The real question is narrower and more useful. What does it cost a global power to fight a long war in one region while claiming another region is more important? And who's already exploiting the gap? The simple explanation is the one most defense reporters would give you, and it's not wrong. Carriers are a finite, exhaustible resource, and right now, one theater is on fire. The U.S. Navy operates 11 aircraft carriers. On paper, that sounds like enormous depth. In practice, at any given time, only 2 or 3 are actually deployed and combat ready. The rest are in maintenance, workups, or on the way home to rest their crews. According to defense analyst Brian Clark, the Navy could soon field 4 carriers simultaneously if the USS Theodore Roosevelt heads to the Middle East, which would let the Washington swing back to the Pacific. Under that reading, this isn't abandonment. It's a temporary, uncomfortable trade-off. Iran is the acute crisis. The Pacific is the chronic one. You put out the fire that's burning today. There's a legitimate logic to that. Chronic pressure can wait a season. Acute war cannot. But here's what that explanation struggles to account for. This isn't a 2-week gap being covered by careful rotation. It's the result of an open-ended war that, by the administration's own admission through officials like Brian Clark, was never properly planned for on a carrier scheduling level. As Clark put it, if the Pentagon had anticipated the Iran conflict running this long, we might have done some changes to the carrier schedule to make sure more would be available. That's not a description of a deliberate trade-off. That's a description of an institution caught off guard by its own war. The exhaustion isn't incidental. It's structural. The USS Gerald R. Ford just completed an 11-month deployment, the longest for a U.S. carrier since the Vietnam War. During that deployment, it wasn't just fighting Iran, it was also supporting the capture of Venezuela's former leader, Nicolas Maduro. 2 theaters, 1 ship, back-to-back. That tells you this isn't a one-off. The carrier fleet is being asked to do simultaneous jobs in the Middle East and the Western Hemisphere, on top of whatever presence the Pacific is supposed to get. The strain is showing up as a human problem, not just a scheduling one. The Ford suffered a fire in a laundry space serious enough to force it back to the Mediterranean for repairs, leaving hundreds of sailors without a place to sleep. The Lincoln, still deployed past its original return date, has drawn concerns serious enough that Democratic lawmakers are now calling for investigations into onboard conditions. Robert Farley, who teaches national security at the University of Kentucky, put it plainly, "People don't get enough rest. It's psychologically exhausting. We are dealing with well-known limits on the capacity of a crew to operate at top efficiency over time, and that just declines." This complicates the temporary trade-off explanation, because exhausted crews and mechanical fires aren't the signature of a well-managed rotation. They're the signature of a force being run past its design limits. Allies are reading the gap as a signal, not a scheduling accident. Whatever the Pentagon's internal reasoning, that's not how it lands in Manila, Tokyo, or Jakarta. Evan Sankey of the Cato Institute notes that carriers function partly as psychological reassurance for allies. Their absence adds to the general sense that the U.S. is distracted by events in the Middle East. And Greg Poling of CSIS goes further, arguing the administration is doing the exact opposite of its own stated Pacific First doctrine. This is where the story shifts from a logistics question to a credibility question. A promise only works if the other side believes you can keep it under pressure. Right now, the pressure is showing. China isn't waiting for an invasion opportunity, it's building a narrative. This is the part worth sitting with. Because it's the most misunderstood. Nobody credible thinks Beijing is about to launch an amphibious assault on Taiwan because one carrier left the region. That's not the mechanism. According to Brian Clark, the real objective is narrower and, frankly, cheaper, using the absence to demonstrate to the Philippines, to Japan, to Indonesia, and others that the U.S. is not the big dog in the Western Pacific anymore. China doesn't need to fight a war to win this round. It just needs regional governments to start quietly recalculating who they think will actually show up if things go wrong. That recalculation is happening through drills, the Scarborough Shoal exercises, the live fire drill off Okinatori, timed to coincide with a period when the U.S. has nothing nearby to counter the message. This gets at something strategists call escalation dominance. But let's skip the jargon for a second and look at the actual problem it describes. Imagine two neighbors in a dispute. One of them keeps a very large, very visible dog in the yard. As long as the dog is there, the second neighbor thinks twice before pushing the fence line. The dog doesn't have to do anything. It just has to be seen. Now imagine the dog gets pulled inside because there's a fire on the other side of the house. The fence dispute doesn't automatically escalate. Nobody's rushing the yard. But the second neighbor starts testing just a little, walking closer, seeing what happens. Not because they have decided to invade the yard, but because the absence itself is information. Maybe this dog isn't watching this fence as closely as we thought. That's what a missing carrier group communicates in great power competition. Not a green light for war, but a change in the perceived cost of provocation. It's why Beijing's naval drills near the Philippines and its live fire exercise off Japan are happening now, not 6 months ago. Deterrence, most of the time, isn't about what a weapon does. It's about what everyone believes it would do and how confident they are that it'll be there when it matters. Here's where this becomes a genuine strategic trap rather than a one-off scheduling headache. The Iran war extends to the Lincoln has to stay out longer than planned, to sailor fatigue, and mechanical strain increase to the Navy, has to pull a carrier from elsewhere to relieve it to the Pacific goes uncovered, to allies read the gap as declining U.S. commitment leads to China increases probing activity to reinforce that narrative, leads to regional partners start hedging their bets, engaging more cautiously with Washington and more carefully with Beijing, leads to which raises the strategic cost of the next Pacific carrier gap. Because trust, once shaken, isn't restored just by a ship reappearing on a map. Each individual decision inside that loop is rational. Nobody chose to abandon the Pacific. Commanders made the best call available given an open-ended Iran commitment nobody fully planned for. But the sum of individually rational decisions is a structural weakening of exactly the deterrent posture the administration claims is its top priority. Now, the strongest argument against treating this as a crisis, carriers might simply be the wrong metric altogether. Michael Swain of the Quincy Institute raises a challenge that cuts against the entire framing of this video. He questions whether aircraft carriers are even the right tool for modern great power deterrence anymore. Carriers are increasingly vulnerable to drone and missile targeting, particularly from an adversary like China that has built its military specifically around denying carriers safe operating room. Smaller ships and submarines, Swain argues, can strike many of the same targets without exposing a multi-billion-dollar, multi-thousand-person ship to that risk. And it's not just outside critics saying this. Admiral Daryl Caudle, the U.S. Navy's own chief of naval operations, told the AP in February that he wants commanders to lean on newer, smaller ships instead of defaulting to carriers for every mission. If that's right, then the missing carrier story might be less significant than it looks. A Navy that's intentionally moving away from carrier-centric deterrence wouldn't necessarily be alarmed by one being absent from the Pacific for a few months. What this counter-argument explains well, it accounts for why senior Navy leadership isn't publicly panicking, and why the gap might close on its own terms as doctrine shifts. What it doesn't explain, the Allied psychology. Doctrine debates in the Pentagon happen on a timescale of years. Manila, Tokyo, and Jakarta are reading the map today, this week, in real time, and diplomatically, symbolically, carriers still carry weight that submarines simply don't, precisely because they're visible. A submarine can't reassure an ally at a port call, a carrier can. So even if the military logic of carrier centrism is fading, the alliance management logic of visible presence isn't fading nearly as fast, and that mismatch is arguably the real story here. Widen the lens and the consequences stack up quickly. A Navy stretched between the Middle East and the Western Hemisphere, with the Pacific treated as the flexible variable, means a maintenance backlog is coming. Carriers returning from record-length deployments will need to cycle through the nation's only 2 carrier shipyards, and as Brian Clark warns, we'll probably have less carrier presence than we've had in previous years because carriers will be lined up to get into the shipyard. That's not a 6-month problem. That's a multi-year bottleneck. It also reshapes how regional partners hedge economically and diplomatically. Countries that feel less certain of U.S. backing tend to quietly diversify their security relationships, which is precisely the outcome Beijing is signaling for. And it raises a domestic political dimension too. Extended deployments, sailor fatigue, and now congressional calls for investigation into shipboard conditions could become a genuine accountability story in Washington, independent of anything happening abroad. Does the USS Theodore Roosevelt actually deploy to the Middle East, freeing the George Washington back to the Pacific on the timeline Brian Clark describes? If it happens fast, this was a short-term squeeze. If it slips, the gap becomes structural. Do China's naval drills near the Philippines and Japan continue or intensify once a U.S. carrier does return to the region? If activity drops off immediately, it supports the opportunistic signaling theory. If it continues regardless, it suggests Beijing's calculus has already shifted independent of carrier presence. Does the Pentagon change its carrier maintenance and deployment scheduling in response to this episode, as Clark suggests it should have done from the start? A visible policy shift would confirm this was a planning failure being corrected. Silence on that front would suggest the administration is comfortable treating the Pacific as the lower priority in practice, regardless of what it says in public. So go back to where we started. An administration that says the Pacific matters more than anywhere else on Earth just left it without a single carrier in order to fight a war in a region it once said it wanted to leave. Maybe that's not hypocrisy. Maybe it's just what happens when a war runs longer than anyone planned for, and a finite fleet gets stretched across 3 oceans at once. The evidence doesn't prove Washington has quietly abandoned its Pacific strategy, but it does prove something uncomfortable. Right now, when push comes to shove, the theater getting the resources isn't the one the administration calls most important. It's the one that's currently on fire. The question worth sitting with isn't whether China will invade Taiwan this year. It's simpler and harder to answer. If the next crisis hits 2 regions at once, which one does America actually show up for? The one it says matters most, or the one that's loudest?